Welcome to the second webinar in the VDI in the Real World series hosted by the Register. We are going to focus today on the user virtualization aspects of VDI, and that's quite the complex topic. As difficult as getting the infrastructure right is, it's always a lot harder to make sure that the user experience can move fluidly from a person's local desktop to their notebook to VDI sessions, and of course each type of VDI session has its own issues. So today we've assembled an expert panel to go over all of these issues, and I'm going to let them all introduce themselves. Merlin?
Of course you have to make me first. Hi, I'm Merlin Boissonneault. I'm an IT technologist from British Columbia. I've spent the last 6 years working in the public sector, and have just recently moved over into the private side as a systems engineer for Tintry.
Thank you very much. Simon?
Hi, I'm Simon May. I'm a technical evangelist at Microsoft based out of Redmond in the US, and I kind of talk about all of our technologies around enterprise devices, and that for us includes kind of giving people access to stuff on virtual platforms as well.
Excellent. Jason?
Yep, this is Jason Mattox with Liquidware Labs, CTO here. My user virtualization user experience goes back to the 90s when we all ran MetaFrame 1.7 and WinFrame, and running video over Ethernet. So I've been in the game for a while. It's fun to see all the same challenges come back around in 2014.
Thank you very much. Kevin?
Yeah, hey, this is Kevin Strohmeyer. I'm Senior Director of Product Marketing for Workspace Services at VMware. Yeah, I've been around the space a little bit. Did stints with Sunray back in the day, as well as Panalogic and Computing and Citrix as well. So I've been playing in this space for quite a while.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to start out with just, the really basic, simple one, and ask everybody, could you define for me what you feel is user virtualization? As with most things with virtualization, it has grown over time. The term has come to encompass a lot more than it might have originally done so. So I'm going to start in reverse order here and ask you, Kevin, what do you think? What does user virtualization mean? What sort of technologies and problems does it encompass?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always the hard spot in this space is the technologies, change fast. I think today, if, ask that question, it really is about how we, think about sort of a very user-centric management model where, applications, files, rights, entitlements are associated, to a user. And then all of those associations, all of the things that makes them unique and really IT is responsible for making them productive, can follow them across devices. So where, we certainly thought of this as maybe just layering, inside of a Windows desktop at one point, it really needs to expand kind of far beyond that, across mobile devices, tablets, laptops, etc. What can they do when they just, log in somewhere from a browser? What can they get access to? What entitlements do they have? What applications, whether they're being distributed by IT or they're, from a software as a service like a Salesforce, right? So really it is that collection of, entitlements, ability to access those files and data anywhere.
Excellent. Jason, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say on top of that would be, virtualization itself generally talks about isolation, and where, user virtualization doesn't really have much of an isolation layer to it. It's more of a layering. As Kevin said, you're layering down user settings, user persona to a device, and all the changes they make follow them. I think one of the challenges that's been creeping up over time that VDI and Zenapp and these technologies have forced out is applications don't always store user persona settings that go along with user virtualization in a location that the user always has rights to. So the tools have had to broaden themselves to capture and be able to capture those things in places they don't have rights to, and be able to remove that user administrative rights over the device. That goes into physical desktops, laptops, and even MDM management over mobile devices. So you have to have an extension to that technology to enable that persona, that user virtualization layer to follow them, even if the user doesn't have rights to those areas natively.
Interesting. And what about incorporating things such as user information that might be stored in databases as opposed to files of the registry? Would that be considered under the user virtualization banner, or is that also sort of a separate technology or a technology that isn't yet incorporated by many companies?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, when you have an application that stores the user settings and presets and things in a database side and is not accessible to the client side necessarily, they're embedded. I think those are more of an embedded situation of a technology. And I think user virtualization hasn't broadened itself to go that route yet. If you think about, you know, what that would look like, if you looked at the individual settings you set inside of Salesforce or inside of Gmail or inside of, you know, different Microsoft Live accounts, those preferences embedded in those SaaS applications, that creates some of a nightmare for a vendor to be able to have the APIs for every single platform to be able to pull those settings through. So that's definitely a challenge when it comes to that. And a lot of the applications that are written for mobile are, you know, some kind of API front end with a web service back end. So they're doing the same thing, potentially storing them on the web server, on the back end database, or they might be storing them in a local cache file on the mobile device. So there's definitely a bridge that has to be built for some of these other challenges, and not to mention going across an iPhone, a Microsoft Windows phone, and an Android on top of that, right?
Yeah, so this is obviously a still expanding universe of definitions and problems. Simon, so you're with Microsoft there, and obviously a lot of what we're trying to capture are Microsoft users and settings. Is there anything that you can add in your experience with VDI on what might be specific elements that make up user virtualization?
I think the one thing that we've actually just kind of discussed really briefly there is that actually user virtualization is not just about technology. It's actually about the person that is being virtualized. And that kind of sounds a bit weird and a bit crass, but actually it's that person. And when we say that things are expanding in the space, it's because the place that that individual wants to be able to use their identity, their access, their permissions, their security, the services, the apps, that's expanding as well. So we have to think about things more holistically than just thinking about a session running on a server. We have to think about how that user is going to interact from their desktop in the office, their laptop when they go into a meeting, their tablet machine, their phone, their device that they happen to use in a internet cafe when they're on holiday because they've left everything else at home. We have to think about it holistically across everything there. And it's about more than just settings management. If we were just going to manage where settings are, then fine, that's actually something that the industry's been doing for years. It's about managing access to data wherever that data is. So it might exist in cloud, it might exist in some database somewhere. The user doesn't care, the user shouldn't need to know. We as IT should just enable access to it. And more importantly, identity is kind of a key cornerstone for all of this. If that person has a different identity on a mobile device to a office desktop in the office desktop sat in the office to a different PC that's in an internet cafe, things start to get very fractured for them. So for me, the cornerstone of being able to successfully virtualize identity, virtualize a user, is actually to maintain identity.
That makes perfect sense. And I mean, back in the day, you go back to the 90s, early 2000s. This is what Active Directory was all about, was the ability to have your single source of identity, and before that it was Novell, and now we have a bunch of competing identity sources from the OpenID stuff to everybody logging on with Facebook or Twitter, and now there's Azure Active Directory if you live in the Microsoft world. So it's evident that there's a lot of different people trying to solve that one particular problem of maintaining identity even when you don't necessarily control the computer the person is using.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting area to explore.
So Merlin, you are somebody who has actually had to fight this battle at the coalface and put this into practice. What was your experience in defining what made up the user virtualization space, the bits of the user profiles and user settings that you actually had to care about moving from desktop to desktop?
Yeah, so the big fight, and this was like for a healthcare provider, was to me, user virtualization was giving someone a space to work in that was unified, like regardless of wherever they were coming in from. It was device agnostic, but it was always the same experience. And it was making their experience and their data and the tools they needed to do their work portable so that they could use it from anywhere. From a technical standpoint, it was very easy to do that with, locking settings down and all that. But then it got a little fun when, people want to be able to have their, funny cat picture follow them around from like different VDI desktop to VDI desktop. And then, just making sure that the connection has the same experience going from like a zero client to a desktop in the corporate world to a desktop at their house or even from their iPad or an internet cafe. And it was a very fun challenge. But I would have to agree with Simon on a lot of the things there. It's like unifying the identity, that's a big thing. Like there's so many great tools out there to sort of virtualize your daily experiences and the tools that you use out there, but then all of a sudden you end up with all of these usernames and passwords and services that you have to remember. Being able to collapse that all into a single identity that you can access from multiple devices is a very powerful tool.
Excellent. So I'm going to, jump a little bit into the practical side here, and I'm going to sort of start in the middle here and point this at Simon and say, so how do we go about doing this? How do we handle the fact that users are moving between devices, not just VDI, but desktops, mobile, the fact that now we are, in some cases, even moving across operating systems, but we still want to take that same user information, those same configurations, that as much of the same experience as possible, and bring it from A to B.
I think in this case of deploying,
what are the tools?
I think there's actually a whole raft of tools that you kind of need. We look at our industry at the moment. We're in kind of a major period of transition from kind of the former kind of, if you think about it as a client-server kind of world, into a less rigidly architectured world. I don't want to say a cloud world because people hate that kind of term when we start talking about technical stuff. This less rigidly architectured world actually requires us to have more tools and more flexibility at the moment. So one of the great tools that you already mentioned was Azure Active Directory. We can connect to, I think it's something like 2,000 SaaS applications now out of that. And as a result of those connections, that one identity can be used to start to have a continuous experience across different platforms. I can sign in using my Azure AD credentials, which are actually my on-prem Active Directory credentials, into Salesforce or Google Apps or wherever I actually need to go. So that starts to become the very first thing. But I also need to take advantage of some other technologies to make this work. So a great example is on the client side of things, inside of a Windows world, we have a technology called UEV, User Environment Virtualization. That kind of goes down to the core of what we're starting to think about as regards user virtualization from that aspect. UEV lets me, as an IT administrator, say, I want to take these settings for these particular applications and store them somewhere that is accessible to that user when they're on this other device that can access the same application. So what that's meaning is it's a different thing from the feedback we've had over the many years of folder redirection and user profiles, is that can be a little bit cumbersome in this kind of new, loosely coupled, loosely architectured world. And therefore, we need something which has that little bit more granular control. So I can take just my Word settings with me, if Word is the main app that I'm using everywhere. And that storage location could be on-prem, it could be something that's published off into some web accessible location. So that's kind of the cornerstone of where things start from. And the same is true with applications as well. We have to start to break the application reliance down on a specific operating system so that application can be taken off of the kind of requirements of the operating system, things like the registry components on that machine, the files that are located on that machine, and taken onto another like operating system, or even available on non-like operating systems.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could build on that for a second, I think the need for the ability to host applications, remotely, right? What we do now with VMware Horizon 6 or the Zenapp or RDSH apps, it still remains sort of that best tool to help take a lot of those existing applications across multiple platforms, right, and have the ability to centralize.
Not everybody is capable of going out and re-engineering their entire application stack for the cloud. So we're still going to be dragging along a lot of these legacy x86 Windows apps for a long time.
Absolutely.
So actually, I want to point that one at Merlin and say, okay, Merlin, you fought this battle with trying to deliver these legacy x86 apps and deliver them on everything from thin clients to iPads. What were the tools you used to make sure that you could do this and that your user profiles and everything would go with it, and that you didn't end up having to have people do things like reconfigure favorites or reconfigure Outlook every time that they logged into a new desktop?
I think the biggest tool was a moderate amount of abuse towards my VMware SE to try and get them to help me make it all happen. But really, the biggest one was VMware View. Without View, I wouldn't have been able to succeed in what we were working on there. Like the issue we were trying to fix was remote access for clinical users, and at the time previous to View, the way that they would access all of their tools that they needed was through Cisco AnyConnect with two-factor authentication through RSA, and then once they were VPN'd in, they would need to have the Citrix plugin installed on whatever device they were using, and then open their sessions through Citrix. As long as they were inside the hospital and clinical environments where there was a direct VPN connection and everything was all good, everything was more or less easy for them because they would just click on Citrix and it all worked. The complication came in when they wanted to work from home, or they got a new PC, or they got different things at their clinic, and then all of a sudden these trouble tickets would start. And there was a lot of different layers to get them access into those environments because each group was responsible for a different piece. And then also iPads became prolific, and the mobile device age started to happen more, and also there's this demand, well, I hear of these doctors in the U.S. that are able to just do all this kind of stuff, and I want that too. Why can't we have this? And that's how View started happening, was we wanted to look at a way to provide a single access point for all of their applications and all their tools that had consistent user experience regardless of what device they were coming in over. So the desktop that we provided to them, it was, we started with View 5. It was link clones, and we utilized persona management through VMware, and that allowed us to have a bit more flexibility with our tools to do refreshes and get almost to a zero downtime state where we can leave chunks of the pool alone for users that were working, refresh the rest of the desktops that new users could come into a fresh desktop, and then clean up those other ones, but then still maintain their identity of the customizations of their desktop, the cute little background pictures or anything that's stored locally, all their Outlook settings, all the different settings. Where it got a little crazy was some of the applications that we were working with, they were designed to work in like a one-to-one desktop kind of world. And with link clones, you never get the same desktop every time. It would be pretty rare for that to happen. So we actually had to go back and use software providers, work with them to modify the applications so that it could work in that kind of environment. But in the end result was a user environment that was totally secure, which was great from a healthcare perspective because now there's no risk of any patient data ever escaping out into the wild because anything and everything that doctors interacted with lived inside the data center, and it was much faster. Previous to the VDI implementation, some of the desktops that were out in the field were taking upwards of half an hour to log in. We got them down to under 10 seconds for login, and now they were able to access it from any device and anywhere they wanted, especially once the HTML blast came out for the desktop overlay. They were very excited for that.
Interesting. That does actually, some of that touch on some very interesting components here, specifically with regards to the fact that you felt that you had to go back to the application vendors to make them more compatible with VDI. I'm actually going to point that one there at Jason and say, well, okay, isn't Liquidware supposed to help us with this concept so that we don't necessarily have to go back and beat up the vendors?
Yeah, that's a semi-weekly thing for us with customers with custom-written applications or applications that are generally written for a one-to-one environment where the user never leaves their machine. When I talked about earlier is that user settings and user persona sometimes goes beyond where the user has rights to. So traditional applications, a lot of times they're in a box on the floor and the user's been granted admin rights because the application required it. And then the user settings get stored in program files or under HKLM or under some arbitrary location that you don't want users to have access to if you can avoid it. So most user virtualization tools are kind of cornered into just the profile path and just the locations the user has rights to as a non-administrator. So with Liqueur Labs and Profile Unity, we have, rights elevation that's included with the product, so we can reach beyond just the traditional location a user has rights to. And this is a common practice with all the different customers we work with. The majority of our customers want non-persistence, and they use non-persistent desktops with VMware. So we always come across some crazy application, because banks have hundreds of applications. We have one customer with thousands of applications, and there's going to be an application in the stack that wants to store things in places it shouldn't. So having that user virtualization tool be able to reach beyond traditional rights the user has out of the box really helps them kind of break the bad habit of, let's make you an administrator over VDI, when you don't have to.
I just want to dive in with one thing here, which is an interesting comment earlier, was that a lot of what we do with VDI is to deal with legacy x86 applications. That's kind of not really the case. What we're actually doing is dealing with a legacy application model from both the way that people stored settings and the way that people interacted with the back-end services for these kind of line of business type applications. If we think about the way the application was architected, it was done that way because people didn't move between devices, and that was the most convenient way to build an application. We would just put the settings into wherever they needed to be on that machine, and different application developers followed guidance in different ways to do that. But there's a more important, I think, interesting and bigger architectural challenge is actually how do we move things into a virtualized world when the back end part of that infrastructure is the hard thing to move. Creating a new UI is actually a relatively low cost activity compared to the big migration project of moving all of that back end infrastructure up into this new application model. And I think that's one of the areas where VDI comes into its own, and user virtualization comes into its own, because it's a great way to offset having to make any of those architectural changes in the relatively short term.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that for a second here. I mean, a lot of this is getting back to the fact that, as much as we'd love to have these modern re-architected web apps, and we'd love to, redesign everything for the latest, greatest operating systems. I mean, we're still at the point where we're trying to get most software vendors to do things like use address space layout randomization, I mean, like, a lot of this stuff is just, there are chunks of the operating system security that we can't even get most vendors to code properly for, let alone being able to go out and deal with what they consider to be corner cases like VDI. And I think a lot of that mentality still exists in developers, and so we're all of us reliant on some 30-year-old application that runs the core portion of the business and is probably never going to see an update, and migrating to another application or taking that data out of there is just too expensive. So in addition to the sort of traditional user virtualization applications and features, I mean, things such as roaming profiles, folder redirection, etc., that are part and parcel of your Windows infrastructure. I would like you to expand a little bit on things like AppV and some of the more advanced features that are often overlooked when considering a VDI setup that are within the Microsoft sphere that come, as part and parcel of our new server operating systems.
Yeah, well,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Simon.
No, you go. It's fine.
Oh, good. I'll remember, Simon. You go ahead.
Okay. So what I was just going to kind of give a quick précis of AppV for anyone that's not familiar with that technology. AppV essentially virtualizes an application by placing it inside of its own bubble, and that bubble has its own, if you like, virtualized version of things like the registry inside of Windows, has its own virtualized version of the file system inside of Windows, so that in essence it has less hooks into the underlying operating system, and that gives us a more portable application. In the world of VDI and remote desktop services, it actually is a really, really powerful tool, because it means that we can have multiple versions of the same application running on the same server. Multiple users can use the same application on the same server. They can use different applications that have been virtualized talking to each other with connection groups, so applications feel like they're still doing the things on a desktop or a laptop or a tablet device that actually they should be doing in the way that the developer intended them to work. It's a nice kind of extra thing to be able to do. It also allows you to do some other cool things with it. So faster deployments through streaming, where you get certain feature groups down a little earlier than other feature groups and that kind of thing. So it's got a nice virtualization set around it. But it really is super useful for deployments when people are going between non-persistent desktops, because it means that we can drop the app-v container in there. They can have their app-v application deployed onto that non-persistent desktop. When we wipe them, their application goes away, and then it can be redeployed again on the next one. And the deployment's very, very quick. It doesn't have to we don't have to sit through a full install or anything like that. So it gives us some great grounding.
ThinApp uses a very similar premise to app-v to containerize the application, put it in its own virtual bubble kind of thing. And that was something that I was really pushing hard for in the VDI implementation that I built there, that I had difficulty gaining traction with because it was a very difficult concept for some of the legacy people there to sort of wrap their mind around. But the value of it is absolutely immense. Like with the ThinApp packaging, if the application supports it, that's sort of the caveat. You do have to do some testing and try and build a ThinApp package of your application and thoroughly test it and make sure it works properly. And if it does, the benefits of it are absolutely great, because you can set up the ThinApp to when you launch it, talk to a repository. And the first thing it'll do when you launch it, if you program it to look in for a repository, is it'll check for an update. And if there's an update, it'll grab the updated bit and launches that updated application without the user even knowing that's happening in the background. So our application people got really excited about that, because for them, they would have to do these big downtimes to roll out a new version of the app and everything. And I was like, well, if you guys got the approval to use this, that doesn't happen anymore, because it's just all done through the packages and uploading into a repository. And then it also makes your desktop management a lot easier, because instead of having to install all of these applications onto your parent image, you just add them into the view repository, and they just show up as links on people's desktops that are enabled. And you can do all of the enablements through Active Directory, so that you don't even have to do a lot of settings through the view console. And with Horizon 6 that's coming out now, this is the coolest part, is the ability to actually just stream applications without a desktop. And for what we wanted to do at the company where we did this VDI, that was actually the goal, was to be able to stream Cerner without any other wrapper behind it. Just have a session that opens up straight to the Cerner UI. And it's kind of cool now with Horizon 6 they can actually accomplish that.
Trevor, there's also an evolution happening with application virtualization as well, when it comes to removing the bubble and removing the complexity of application compatibility when it comes to ThinApp and app-v, which we tend to call application layering. And application layering is kind of the sister technology, has the similar benefits of having an application but without the bubble. Now obviously it can't do Internet Explorer 6 and 7 on the same machine, but application layering can support PDF printers, drivers, services, CD-ROM burners, all kinds of things that are challenging when you put things into a bubble. So there's definitely an evolution happening. And then the next evolution on top of that is delivering the application layer in a different way. ThinApp and app-v traditionally are delivered through a network share. So you're limited to the speed of the bandwidth between you and the file server. Well, let's take that application layer and containerize it into a VMDK or a VHD and let the hypervisor present it to the desktop when you see the assignment of a user to a desktop. So now we can say this user has been assigned to this desktop. They have access to these applications, and these applications are on these VMDKs or VHDs, and then modify that virtual hardware and attach those SCSI devices with those applications. And now what you've created is you've created a user experience that is if it was a persistent desktop with the applications baked in the base image, but the applications are actually on a different storage volume than the actual link clone desktop might have been. And now that experience of opening the app, closing the app, reopening the app is all as if it was in the base image. That's kind of the evolution that we see happening in the industry when it comes to application virtualization. Both products will coexist, and they both have their purpose. But I think generally you see the market going after kind of a higher compatibility rate and different delivery of those apps.
Yeah, if I can build on that too.
And I'm seeing that in the new generations of VMware software here. And I'm expecting, of course, that this will be in the next generation of Windows software And I mean, of course, there's Zenapp on Citrix's side as well. So I mean, there are at least 3 of these put your applications in a bubble. Moving beyond the application in a bubble or the delivery of the application just as a VHD there are other elements to what we consider to be the user preferences and profiles version of an application. What elements might we be missing in being able to bring those applications there that can't be handled by just AppV or ThinApp or Zenapp?
I think, are you referring to kind of if you put the application into a layer and do a delivery of that layer?
Yes.
Yeah. So you get a compatibility uptick. ThinApp and AppV traditionally are creating a bubble, and it separates a lot of services and drivers from the operating system. So something like Adobe Acrobat Professional, where you have a PDF printer, you want to use that PDF printer against all the applications that you're running in the system, whether it be AppV, whether it be an application layer, whether it be ThinApp, whether it be in the base image. You want to be able to leverage that. So you can layer down drivers, printer drivers, or CD-ROM burning software, or USB drivers, or anything like that with application layering traditionally can be delivered. That gives you that uptick, and the packaging process, potentially depending on the vendor, could be less painful. Maybe as standard as going through the install process like normal, checking into the console, and assign it to the user, depending on the product. So you definitely get, something simple like daemon tools. I want to install daemon tools. I want to install VPN software that creates a virtual network card. And how do I have it so that the VPN software is laid back down to the operating system and that virtual network card is created again? The utopia for everybody trying to go non-persistent would be there is almost nothing in the base except for Windows updates and Windows itself. Let the broker technology, whether VMware, Microsoft, or Citrix, deliver that desktop with nothing in it via the broker and layer everything else in, user virtualization, application layering, application virtualization, session streaming, whatever it might be, so that you have the least number of images to deal with and the least downtime and management of having to modify and update applications in that base OS.
Yeah, I think the choices are getting easier in that the reason we talk so much about non-persistence is the assumption that really to make VDI affordable and to make it manageable at any sort of scale, you had to be non-persistent. Just the time to create and patch, and then obviously the cost of very high I/O storage behind it. So lots of external factors have improved the situation, right? You don't have the cost of high I/O storage behind VDI is, tenth of what it was maybe 3 years ago. So for those user communities that really do want something that feels like a persistent desktop, which they in many cases should want, and we should want to deliver, so they can just pick up where they left off, right, from day to day in many cases. The cost of doing that is much lower than before. So it doesn't have to be this horrible trade-off discussion about are these users going to get this locked down throw away desktop, and we're going to try to redirect some profiles, or are they really going to get something that's much more like what they were used to on a traditional PC? So I think what Jason was just describing, right? These new technologies are enabling you to sort of build at a VM layer something that really is a persistent desktop, without the storage baggage and the management baggage, right? Is just dramatically different than where we were in the past.
It's still the one trouble with if you're going to do the persistent desktop thing is if you do ever have to modify that user's desktop for any reason, they now no longer have access to it. And that was our big reason for not sticking with the persistent desktops, was that in our use case, there was no real tolerance for even like a half hour of no access. Like access needed to be maintained consistently. So it sort of pushed us away from persistent, and we had to do non-persistent. And even like for Windows updates and stuff like that, we ended up using like a hypervisor-based security product that would do some sort of like virtual protection for really critical patches and stuff if we didn't have time to get around to being able to patch as quickly as we wanted to all the time.
Yeah, the difference between which applications you choose and which delivery models you choose really do boil down to what's your tolerance for downtime. So to get maybe away from some of the abstraction layers, I mean, we've been talking about a lot of this stuff at some very high level here. I want to get down to a little bit of the nitty-gritty because, I personally have some questions, and I would love to pick some of your brains. So in a more basic VDI setup, we run persistent desktops for a lot of our users, for example, and roaming profiles, folder redirection, etc., doesn't necessarily take all of those user elements from VDI instance to personal desktop and so on. A great example of this being the autofill settings in Outlook. And it's a really, really small thing, perhaps, at least from how IT looks at it, but from a user experience perspective, this is huge. They're used to clicking new email and typing in the first 3 letters of the person's name, and then it will simply autofill. And one of the most annoying things in the world for our users, if we use just roaming profiles and folder redirection, is that the autofill settings don't go with them. Now you can get an application called NK2 and attempt to pull that one particular thing across, but I mean we're talking about attempting to do this sort of application by application by application, and it's all about where this gets stored. In this case, Outlook happens to be storing this in not in the roaming section of the user profile, but in the local section of the user profile. So what tools are we going to be using, from VMware, from Microsoft, from Liquidware, that can wrap up those elements of the user profile that are normally considered to be local to the machine as opposed to, part of the roaming profile, and take those from desktop to desktop? What are the actual product names that we should be out there looking for?
This is Jason. I guess I'll jump in first here. So, Profile Unity from Liquidware Labs is going to maintain anything you need in the entire user profile. So as Microsoft mentioned earlier, we were talking about UEV, and it has the ability to go and grab settings, granular settings that you might be looking for. Profile Unity was originally created grabbing granular settings anywhere within the profile path, app data, local, or roaming. What we've done is we've created kind of templated wizards that guide you through a more broad approach to grabbing, everything you would need as a user that you care about, all of your Outlook settings, all of your signatures, all your N2K files, all those things, and helping you travel those from one desktop to another. So you can pick your use case that you're looking for. If you're looking for coexistence, Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1, Server 2012, 2003, we can make that persona and all those settings move between. Obviously, application versions will take hold there if you get different versions of the applications, but if they're traditionally the same applications across the board, we can have those settings travel across all those operating systems. The other 2 things I'll mention with that is, again, grabbing those settings when they're outside of the profile and getting those. So if they're outside of the profile, that's easy. If they're inside of the profile, that's even easier in the profile path. And then on top of that, being able to just add a filter to be able to control. I can control how I deliver that user persona, what parts of the profile you might not get. So for example, I could decide that I can tell through the view client that you're coming in from an iPad to VMware Blast from a touchscreen device. I can make a decision not to give you the shortcuts on your desktop for the applications that are not touch-friendly, and only give you the applications, the Win32 apps that are conducive to touch. So I can make decisions like that with the shortcuts you have, the parts of the profile I may not deliver. I may not deliver parts of your profile if you're on a different type of connection or different device, and I may make a decision on that. So I can decide not just user group and OU, but I can decide on hundreds of other things, the subnet you're coming from, the area you're located in, the device you're coming from, is it a laptop, all these different things I can make decisions on.
Excellent. Now, Kevin, Jason or Merlin here was talking about VMware's persona. Can you expand a little bit on where that fits into this?
You bet. A big part of persona management, right, is the use of folder redirection and roaming profiles. Still can work. The traditional problem has been that when a user logs into a non-persistent desktop and you start pulling down this huge profile, it really makes the login way too long, right? So for so many of those environments that really can sort of leverage those existing technologies, how do you sort of stream the profiles, if you will, when needed, right? Present the right profile information, when needed for the application, rather than having to pull it all down at once. So that's part of the persona management that's built directly in to the product. The other piece for that is you can sort of adjust the settings for that persona management independent of your AD group. And that can be useful when you do need to sort of treat that virtual desktop environment maybe different than what that user would see on other desktops. So it's a nice bit of flexibility there to help solve problems.
Excellent. Simon, so what does Microsoft have that goes beyond roaming profiles and folder redirection to handle exactly these issues?
So we're really looking there at UEV as being the tool for dealing with these kind of things. And it is that granular tool where you can specify particular registry keys, particular areas to be able to roam. And that actually does include the app data local folder. So you can actually roam the app data local folder for a specific application using UEV. Kind of cool. There is also another folder called local low, and you can't redirect local low. We actually exclude that from the capture process inside of UEV. The reason for that is that those two places have slightly different intended uses by a developer. So when a developer puts something into local, it is supposed to be a setting which may not roam particularly well or is a really big file. And UEV gives you the ability to kind of override that particular lack of roaming ability. Anything in local low is actually intended for kind of point-in-time integrity writing. So you would write into local low if your application needed to know something and you wanted it to be persistent for a while. It's an area that an app developer can then use. So it's possible to get more roaming based on that particular technology, and it's a technology that we're expanding and developing pretty continuously. The other thing was, specifically, you mentioned Office and being able to move Outlook settings around. There's a kind of interesting thing around this in that some of the, all of the most recent cool things that have happened inside of Office have tended to be inside of Office 365. And it gives you a kind of interesting view on the way that settings roaming is happening now within applications. Office 365 obviously is the cloud-enabled version of Office that we produce, and there's a back-end service which provides a whole load of stuff around Office itself. One of those things is the ability to roam certain settings. So there's a nice little effect. Actually, I keep it turned off because I don't like it, but you can turn it on. Most people do. Inside of Office is to have like a kind of this background wallpapery thing over your ribbon taskbar. That now roams as part of your Office 365 settings. So anywhere that I sign in with my Office 365 account and I stream Office down from the web, it actually comes down, streams down, kind of in an AppV container onto my machine, and I end up with my personalized settings appearing immediately for me inside the application. So it's kind of twofold, really. When you think about apps, the reason that we have to do all this virtualization is because people are using older versions of applications. Newer versions of applications built with this more loosely coupled cloud-based architecture actually do a lot of this stuff for you. So there's a good argument here as to updating applications to make sure that things roam better.
I think that left our host speechless.
I think so. I think maybe Trevor's gone.
Oh, sorry, I had muted it. No, I think that's that's fair enough. I mean, that's a very rational and pragmatic view on how to deal with things. But the counter to that perhaps is that not all developers play nice, and not all developers put all their files into the places where they're supposed to. And certainly there are a lot of applications that we're all dependent on that even the newer versions are going to be nowhere near cloud ready, nowhere near able to move the settings. So for those developers who actually are, taking hold of things like Microsoft and saying, hey, the world is moving on. You have to be able to deal with these expanded use cases that your users are coming up with. That's great. And, Office actually is a great example of this in that as you move up into the newer versions, they really are taking advantage of these new use cases. But from what I'm hearing here, it sounds like in order to deal with the fact that we have all these legacy applications and we have all these, legacy models that some developers are still using, we're still going to be looking at a combination of technologies to really deliver the full experience to people. So the last question and area that I have here is simply, automation of all of this, orchestration of all of this. As we have all of these different technologies that we're probably going to have to bring together to be able to deliver the totality of the experience that we want. There's no one package, no one product from no one vendor that's going to solve the VDI user experience. What are we using, or what should we be using to automate and orchestrate all of this? I mean, in my case, we do a lot of this sort of delivery and config management and all of that using Puppet, but there are, of course, limits to that and to how deeply Puppet can hook into some of the technologies that you guys are using. What do you guys recommend for the automation and orchestration of the dance that is user virtualization?
Well, I guess I'll dive in there because we have the, what's the polite way of saying this? The broadest array of orchestration products that are possibly available, and you combine all that tooling together with about 50 different ways of orchestrating anything within a Windows environment. But I think there's a couple of key ones to point out, really. Configman, System Center Configman is probably one of the most important tools that people have. Something like 65% of all enterprises around the world are actually using Configman to some degree. And that's actually a great place. If you look at the more recent versions of Configman, 2012, 2012 R2, they actually support the ability to deliver applications to users based on the type of device they're using. So we can differentiate between when they're using a desktop, a laptop, a tablet, a phone, an iPad, an Android, an OS X device, a VDI instance, an RDS instance, and deliver the application down to them in a different way. And they can also deliver the settings down to people in different ways. We can push out a configuration item which makes an iOS device install an email profile, and we can push out a configuration item which makes a Windows device install a email profile, and the same thing for other devices as well. So those kind of orchestration techniques are very useful. They can also be used to push down UED profiles from our case, which is kind of cool. And there's a rich plugin architecture for Configman, which means that anybody can basically write code which will plug into Configman, and then their solution can be used for that management as well. But you mentioned Puppet, and I think that's a really cool place to look at. If I start thinking about where the future of configuration actually lands, it's probably with the ability to set what the desired state is for the service that's being run. So if the service is VDI, then we want to be able to set a desired state that says these network ports are open, these are the services that are running, these are the applications that are installed, this is what happens to this particular user, this is where this user's settings are stored. I think the most important thing about desired state is that we have to, again, realize that this might not just be happening onto a Windows device. We might need to be able to deploy desired state to Linux devices, to other operating systems, for example. So that's kind of where those more broad technologies, for us that's PowerShell with desired state configuration, they come in. And those broad technologies tend to have the most granular level of configuration that you can possibly go and deploy.
Excellent. Kevin, what do you guys recommend for the orchestration of this?
Yeah, I mean, on our side, we're certainly thinking in a virtual desktop environment, about the underlying infrastructure, right? Lots of moving parts, and I think a lot of the early days of VDI again, where you had to have a pretty good map of where your pools were, where your the different tolerances for different user groups, different performance levels, etc. And deploying it once, is relatively straightforward, but as the environment moves, as your infrastructure moves over time, then you're sort of constantly, wondering, right? Am I set or not? With the integration we've been doing on the vCloud Automation Center, we've really effectively put that abstraction layer, between the individual VDI desktops, MS services that need SLA, that need particular level, and then let the infrastructure figure out, where to run those workloads, maintain those workloads over time, and then now you're looking at the problem at a more granular analytical level to know, how do I manage capacity over time and not have to try to plan where I move my workloads as I'm trying to grow into.
All right, Jason.
Sure. So when I look at this, I think about it, as you stated earlier, kind of the user virtualization side of it. And strictly, if I focus there for a second, you should be able to set up your user virtualization tool or management tool of the user in such a way that your kind of delivery of what the user needs ahead of time is just managed automatically, and it's more of a set it and forget it type of situation. An example would that be, I've got a certain group of users. They have a certain behavior that IT approves. IT approves that they can move from different machines, they can go to VDI, they can log in from home. That's their behavior for the set of users. And that's a static set, and that application delivery might be a part of that. User persona virtualization might be a part of that. And when I use my HR or provisioning software that most enterprises use, I put that user in a set of groups because of their identity of who they are and where they're going to work. And when they're a part of those groups, all the other triggers follow along with that. The delivery of the shortcuts, the delivery of the application, there's a ThinApp or an app or it's a shortcut to a SaaS app, whether it's the user persona they're going to get out of the box, whether it's a bunch of files that need to be stubbed into their home directory because they need these files ahead of time because I want them to have a jump point of the settings that the applications they're going to leverage out of the box defaults. All those things kind of user virtualization and management of the user just follows along the existing orchestration. I think the only thing that we're expanding upon now is as we have this mobile user and the user moves around, we just have to update our policy internally in IT and then update the product to make a decision on what things we want to change. But it shouldn't have to be a situation where I have to go into the tool every time a new user is hired. It should just follow in line with the existing automation kind of around the back end. And then if you look at what VMware is doing with Horizon Workspace, we can just sit and right along that. Whenever Horizon Workspace presents a VDI desktop or a published app, we can provide settings movement between both the published app and the VDI desktop both. And the same things I said earlier will follow suit.
Excellent. Sounds good. I think that we're reaching the end of the questions that I had originally to drive all this, but we do happen to have quite a few user questions. Geez, I really sound like a systems administrator, eh? Audience participation questions. You are not users. You are the administrators. Let's get to those. The very first one is, and actually quite a good one, are there tools to determine where a user's personal information is being stored by an application? So it's one thing to already know where the information is and go forth and tell your various tools, we need to glom on that. But short of going to the vendor of the application and begging for information, do we have any widgets that will tell us where is this application actually storing that info?
Oh, can I dive in on that one? The first job I ever had inside of IT, I think the second, but the second job I ever had, I consider it to be my first real job, was actually as an applications packager. It was back packaging applications for SMS 1.2 and doing delivery with that kind of stuff. And I think there's an interesting set of tools which we discovered back then, which have never really changed, to be honest, in terms of being incredibly good at doing what they do. And that, honestly, as I'm guessing most people know here, is the sysinternal suite. So the sysinternal suite of tools that actually enable you to monitor what processes are being accessed, what registry keys are being accessed, what files are being accessed on a machine, what network shares are being connected to. That is really, really handy, granular stuff. And it's what I always break out to whenever I need to kind of get really into the nitty-gritty of what is an application doing, where is it writing, where is it reading. That's what I break out.
The follow-up to that would be a product called RegShot. So sysinternal tools, I use them as well quite a bit on troubleshooting. Sysinternal's tools, it takes a little bit of time to get really proficient and filter things down. RegShot is something where I can take a shot of the registry and file system, open an application, make a checkbox change, close the application, take another shot, and then dump the compare, and then see kind of generally within kind of one screen length of where that setting was dropped in to the registry or file system, and then add that to my tool.
Excellent. So we can figure out sort of where the applications are putting that information. One of the things that I have been wondering about as well, and I've had a couple of questions out of band here on this, is regards Liquidware's ability to go through and virtualize bits of the applications and their configurations that are not part of the security settings that an individual user will have. You know, as you were saying, sometimes you log the user on as a local administrator because that's what some application wants, and that's really not what we as systems administrators want to do. And certainly in things like a non-persistent environment, that becomes a lot more difficult. How exactly does Liquidware go about doing that? Is there an agent that ends up being installed and proxies, requests, or what's the back end behind how that particular trick is pulled off?
Sure, that's a really good question, and we're quite proud of that technology. It's a very slick and unique technology in a way. So one little level set on just permissions in general. When you log in, you then have a token. That token makes up the group memberships you're part of. And every process you launch as a user follows your token. Every child process is created with the parent process token. So when I log into a system, the chain loader kicks off in Windows, user init runs, you might have seen that executable, and then Windows Explorer runs, and every child process you run is pretty much from Windows Explorer, and it all inherits your permissions and your token for that executable. So what we do is we have a service that sits on the desktop. Service runs under system, does not need any credentials whatsoever. And since we sit in the chain loader of Windows, so we run everything we do before Windows Explorer loads. We lay down the profile just like any other user management software would or user virtualization software would. When we kick off our client, we make a request to our service that says, we are code signed, we're digitally certified to be Liquidware Labs. I'm requesting that you run this process with this user token, but also make that token have the administrator group's membership. And so what will happen is our chain loader will run with the user token, all the same rights, all the same environment variables, HKey current user is the same, everything is identical as if the user was just the user, but temporarily our processes are running with the administrator group rights. Then when our processes close, we then, from the unelevated user init, call Windows Explorer, the session continues unelevated, so just the processes. On top of that, the additional technology we did build in is real-time elevation. That same technology I talked about where we make a request for elevation, you can be a client and you can be approved based on policy. We now also have real-time elevation that says in Pro U6 coming out early next week is that I can decide that there's a process that just got opened, it's in the policy, I'm going to go ahead and elevate it because that application needs to run with administrative rights. Not that the application writes into a spot, but you can't even open it without administrative rights, which also happens in the industry as well. So we can actually launch that process elevated. And what's unique about that as well is you can't leave a vulnerability. By launching a process elevated, if you listen to what I said earlier, if I as a user go into Word and type in file : // Windows System 32 regedit.exe, that would be a child process. You could click the hyperlink, kick off regedit.exe from an elevated Word process and potentially own the system. Well, we actually de-elevate child processes that are user invoked from an elevated parent process that we elevated. So it's actually really interesting technology. The elevation of the core product itself exists in the market today with our current version. The real-time elevation is being released early next week, coincidentally.
Cool. I didn't know that, but that is awesome. All right, so I have a question here for Simon, which is Microsoft planning on implementing Office 2013 application roaming support directly through UEV rather than through a separate group policy?
I don't know off the top of my head, but if I can get an email address, I can find out and email that person.
Okay, if you wanted to ping me or to ping Simon directly, I'm sure that we can make sure that we get that answer emailed to you out of band. The next question here, and again, a good one, which seems to follow up on some of the debate in the chat, is with all the tools to virtualize desktop and applications, is the persistent desktop dead? And before I pass it on to any of the panelists, I want to take a bit of a crack at that to say that I'm not entirely certain that the persistent desktop will ever really die. Part of this is simply money. The persistent desktop ends up being cheaper in some ways than having to layer on all of the additional applications and put in the time to learn to manage them, etc., for specific workloads and applications and specific companies. Certainly when you start getting into huge volumes of desktops, as Merlin had pointed out very earlier on, it becomes a lot more difficult to run these persistent desktops simply because you have issues surrounding availability. Do you have your nerds that are around between midnight and 6 a.m. to do all the patching and take all the desktops down, or do you have that fully automated with Puppet and everything to go through and handle all of these updates to your desktops? And do you have the I/O necessary to have 1,000 VDI instances all doing their Windows updates at the same time versus just updating a master image? So there are some people that I know of within the industry who are convinced, persistent desktops are dead, and another group that says, no, they're not dead, we're going to go back to there. So I'm going to actually expand this when I throw it to the panelists here. Beyond just persistent, non-persistent, let's talk about full clones versus link clones and the realities of that and which of these models are going to stick around. So is there anybody on the panel that wants to take that one up?
This is Jason. I'll take a first stab at this one. I'm a big fan of non-persistence because that's the constant request I get from our customer base. But I can't be naive and say that persistent is going to die. Persistent will be around. There's going to be pockets of persistent. Would I like to see a majority of the industry, shift to where it's a majority non-persistent and then persistent is a minority? I think it should, from a management standpoint and cost standpoint. Yes, technology will get faster, SSDs will get faster, and some of those things go away. And some customers, they say to themselves, I have a group of people that do job X, a group of people that do job Y, and by putting a non-persistent, it requires a different tool than those people are used to, and they want to deploy, SCCM Altiris-based packages that way forever, and we're not changing internal processes, and that'll just be a political thing. I think as technology expands, even our own, like FlexApp, our application layering, we're going to continue to deliver application layers to persistent desktops and to Zenapps and to RDSH with VMware, so that you have one layer of an application that we call light switch, which means if the service is running, the application is available. If the service is stopped, the application disappears. So you can deliver a light switch-based application layer to a physical, virtual, persistent, non-persistent, Zenapp, ZenDesktop, RDSH, and those operating systems. So you're going to continue to have kind of the evolution of delivery expand beyond non-persistent and expand to persistent. So if you do have some things you need to keep because of persistence, but at least you can have one level of experience for the administrator and the user to deliver the application. That's all I had there.
Merlin, do you want to tackle the linked clones versus full clones debate?
Maybe he's on mute.
I don't know. What about anybody else? Anybody want to grab onto that?
I would say I think it all depends on your use case. Like that's the biggest thing for VDI, and for a lot of people that I've talked to through all of the VMUGs and whatnot, it seems to be the one thing that gets missed a lot is why are you actually doing VDI and what are you actually using it for? And because it's such a cool, great thing, and everyone wants to do it. And there's lots of CIOs that get all excited, and they're like, "I want VDI because I read a really cool article about it." It's like, what do you actually want to do with it? And as you start figuring out what you want to do with it, who's going to be using it, where are they going to be using it, then you can start figuring out, are persistent desktops going to work for you, or non-persistent desktops going to work for you? Do you want to do the link clones, or do you want to do full desktops? We liked link clones a lot because it made management easier, because we could just make one golden image, and then it's just one thing to update, and you just blast it all out. It was a little friendlier to our storage. There's just a lot of reasons why it made sense for us in the use case that we loosely came up with. But ultimately, I think it just all boils down to what is going to be right for the environment that you're trying to build.
Fair enough. So I've got two more here, and these are the only two that I think that we'll have time for. The first one is, and I guess this one would be directed at Jason. Microsoft's click once technologies don't work well with roaming profiles. Do you know of instances in which you guys have managed to make the click once delivered apps work on VDI desktops? I'm assuming here on sort of non-persistent desktops where you're going to have roaming users moving from one desktop instance to another.
Yeah, so I saw that question there as well, and I did a quick search in our knowledge base, and our support team has created a KB around this. So they've definitely been able to create the configuration required to make one-click work applications to make them roam from one desktop to another. So we definitely have the ability to make that happen.
Excellent. So another question that's come through is, what issues arise when you use multiple user virtualization applications to deliver applications to the same desktop? And considering that as we're going through this, it seems that no one technology does all of the things that we want, this is probably a very relevant question to close out the webinar on.
I was going to say, if the applications are delivered multiple ways, it comes down to how the vendor and where the vendor is storing their settings. You know, if it's an application layering approach, the settings are going to be stored in a traditional location the application would want to write to. If it's a ThinApp or an app V, you might have a sandbox or location within the profile that contains a sandbox or somewhere else that you might have to configure your profile tool or user virtualization tool to grab those settings to be able to play those back or layer them down back to the operating system.
Excellent. So I believe that answers the questions that we have time for, and I would like to thank everybody for attending, and certainly thank you to the panelists for taking the time out. Are there any closing remarks that you as panelists want to make?
No, this is Jason. I guess from a company standpoint, we're definitely willing to help you find the best strategy to help solve your VDI problems and/or physical challenges you're having in your infrastructure. So definitely reach out to us on our website, lookwherelabs.com, and we can definitely help find the right strategy for you to solve any challenges you have in the desktop space. Definitely good questions today. I love this kind of conversation with the industry, and I enjoyed it. I can't wait for the next one.
I'd just like to say thank you for everyone for listening to us for the last almost an hour and a half talking about this. So yeah, totally happy to do this again if people find it useful.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Trevor, for throwing this all together. And the only thing that I can really say is really think about why you want VDI and what you're going to do with it. Like so many people I've talked to in the last year and a bit about VDI are sort of stumped on those questions, and then they end up having difficulties in what they're trying to build. So just like a little thought and planning ahead of time makes your life so much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just build on that to thank everybody for joining. And to the same thing, I think when people do go into these projects, they start planning out sort of all the possibilities, which is it's great. But you do have to start somewhere, and you do have to really understand that initial use case. Set yourself up for success, kind of nail the first one, if you do that, you're not going to make a bad decision up front, right? And then from there, you can continue to knock off the next one. If you need different tools or a different approach, that's fine, right? But at least you've got a good base, and you're not struggling from the start to hit too many use cases at the same time.
I'd like to close this out also by adding a bit of a note on my own here, which is that I think Simon and to a larger extent Microsoft have an absolutely bang-on approach to some of this, which is consider updating your applications. Consider maybe migrating some of those older applications to newer ones. The fact that we can do VDI and that we can go through and virtualize the user experience, virtualize aspects of user profiles, etc., doesn't mean that we should. And I know that there are always political reasons within an organization to keep a bunch of old applications ticking along for decades. But the newer stuff sometimes may solve your problems for you and may prevent you from spending months or even years getting all of the user virtualization elements beaten out, especially with the older applications. So as Merlin had said, always ask yourself, why are you doing VDI and what is the end goal? Ask it not just as a broad element, but on an application-by-application basis. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you to the panelists. This has been a VDI in the Real World webinar from the Register. We'll see you next time.